Are content designers getting in their own way? Today I talked to a content design manager at Meta who says that content designers might be their own worst enemies when it comes to making progress and wielding influence. If you're looking for ways to get more influence in your organization and become a better content designer in general, then this interview is for you. Hey, welcome back to Writers of Silicon Valley. My name is Patrick Stafford. I'm your host, and this is the podcast where I interview content designers and UX writers from around the world. So today I've got a pretty spicy interview, and this is something that a lot of content designers might disagree with, but I think it's an important conversation. So last year, Victor Beigelman, who is a content design manager at Meta, wrote a piece on his Substack where he argued that maybe some of the problems that content designers are experiencing, our inability to get into meetings or wield influence, might actually be our own doing in some parts. And so I got him on the podcast today to talk about it. Now, you may not agree with everything that's in this conversation, but I do think it is a perspective worth talking about. So that's what the interview is about today. So if you're looking for ways to wield influence or grow influence in your organization, I think Victor has a lot of really great points and would definitely recommend you listen to what he has to say. Before we get to the interview, I just want to let you know, and this is a heavy sales pitch, so I'm sorry to say, UX Content Collective has a sale on at the minute. It's a 25% off sale. So if you're interested in learning new skills, would definitely recommend things like our Systems Thinking workshop run by Dave Connis, or the Mastering Design Systems in Figma workshop by Ayelet Kessel from Wix. These are just some of the great workshops and courses that I would definitely recommend taking a look at. So it's through April 6th, so just wanted to let you know so you don't miss out. 25% off. The other thing I want to mention is that last week, UX Content Collective had a spicy take summit where we got 5 content designers and we had them give their best hot take on the industry. And it was a really great time. And there's a recording if you didn't attend. So I'll link to that in the show notes. And in fact, Victor, who's the interviewee today on the podcast, actually gave his hot take there as well. So this is consider this an extension of his hot take. So we would definitely recommend checking that out. All right, I'm not going to leave you hanging too long. This is my interview with Victor Beigelman from Meta about how content designers might be getting in our own way. I hope you enjoy it.
And White Lotus, almost episode by episode lately, and that's been enjoyable.
Are you a Severance fan?
I am. We have a big finale tonight or tomorrow.
Oh, tonight? Yeah. I'm keen, but I don't watch it until night, so I have to stay off. It's morning here, so I have to stay off the internet.
It would be a weird watch at like 10 a.m. I don't think it's really right for that.
Yeah, it's not the right vibes. But I'm excited for that. But I'm really happy to talk to you. There's a thing in content design where I feel, for better or worse, that a lot of the opinions that are shared tend to follow a standard discourse. And a lot of that discourse tends to be, we're not valued, we're not, we don't have enough influence. And you wrote a piece last year that I think asked some very good questions about like how much of our content design's problems are caused by us. And I thought it was a really great introduction to kind of a thesis. But before we get to that, so you started in journalism and you're at Meta now. How did you get into the field and how did you get to where you are now?
Yeah. Well, thanks for saying that about the piece. And I'm excited to talk about that too. For the like brief history, I did have a background in journalism, and this was sort of like 10, 15 years ago, as we were kind of talking about at the outset, when it felt like a very exciting possibility to me to get into like entertainment and pop culture media. Things were changing a lot from, they continue to change a lot today, but back then it was like a big shift from traditional media to these digital media upstarts who grew a lot on the back of like traffic from Facebook. And I freelanced for some of those places. We were talking about AV Club, that's one of them. And then I joined a couple of small startups as like a hybrid assistant editor, but also without really realizing it, sort of a UXer and product thinker. Um, and when the latter of those started to fold, I was looking around for new roles. And I had a small contract role at Facebook in like 2014 to 2015 before I'd had those media roles. And still had a contact from those days who said, there's this team called Content Strategy. Um, you know, I was on a team called Public Content Operations at that time. He was like, "You're also a writer, I think, right? So like maybe this role could be good for you." And that was just from the connection of the word content, which is, as you and I know, like a really ambiguous word that doesn't mean anything, but also means everything. But it was kind of fortuitous because it turned out that content strategy was something that I had already been doing a little bit without realizing it. I think that's happened to a bunch of people. It sort of opened this door into like product and UX more broadly. And I had sort of been at the whims of Facebook in a way, riding this traffic wave that I was talking about in digital media. And so it sort of just felt like the right jump for me to like try a whole new role full time and maybe even get to work on products at Meta that could help like the news industry in some ways, which I'd sort of felt firsthand as like being the kind of place that was really rocky and fractured and felt like you had to jump to a new role every 6 months. So that's sort of the brief history of how I landed in the current role. And, I've been there for almost 8 years. So that feels like ages ago now.
I want to talk about your thoughts about what's happening in the industry right now, because you wrote this piece, and we'll link to it in the show notes. And your thesis is essentially, if I can summarize you correctly, I think you might have to correct me, is that content design is an important role, but we are putting up our own roadblocks in a way. I'd love to hear you talk more about that and what you mean by that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And, I'd sort of intended it to be like sort of a gentle critique, if I may, of content design, because like I mentioned, I've been in it at Meta for 8 years. Like it's been great to me. I've learned a lot. It opened a lot of doors for me, and I care deeply about the practice. At the same time, I think the way that I phrased it was that, it's starting to feel collectively that we're maybe bumping up against the ceiling in some ways as a discipline, which doesn't mean like raise the alarm bells, it's all over. And that's not because of AI or anything like that, although we could get into that. I just think that I've sort of observed over time that, not to get too philosophical about it, but I sort of believe in the idea that your biggest strengths can be your biggest weaknesses sometimes. And in the case of content design, I found that like it's a practice of people that are deeply empathetic. They have a high attention to detail, like we're writers and editors. That makes sense. We have a really clear feel for systems. Sometimes these are qualities that actually like hold us back when it comes to things like getting a seat at the table, exacting influence, leading, as like a product thinker. And I think that's because, sometimes we find ourselves like caught up in aspects of the practice and of the discipline in ways that like it might be helpful for us to let go of. For example, like, I think people have come on your pod and like, outside of it, probably people talk about this a lot too. Like it's difficult to be in a practice where everybody else also uses like your main skill pretty openly and frequently. Everybody's a communicator. Many people write. And at the same time, like we were hired to do a specific job. So I understand this inclination, but sometimes we can come off as like the language police, which is, I don't think the the perception that you want to give off, or the role that like anybody actually wants to be in. And what I mean by that is that leaning too much, I guess, like on being brought in as experts in like a field of writing, to sort of lean on like justification for why we think, a given solution is right.
Hmm.
Um, and uh, I've sort of felt more and more that, like, as a content designer at a place like Meta, working on product teams, I get very engaged, and I feel like as a result, my influence is greater when sort of I let preconceptions of like what my discipline is or my title is sort of fall to the wayside, and I'm actually like producing work with a group of XFN partners towards like a common goal, and like demonstrate it, like, yes, giving like the nugget of like, hey, I'll fill out, like, I'll be your content vending machine and I'll plug in words here, and like I'll give you a given string here, but always packaging that in something greater that other product functions can actually like resonate with, like data, using a framework to deliver something, leaning on research insights, what have you, to just demonstrate that you're like a strong product thinker, and you can drive towards the same goals as everybody else has on a team. Um, and like you're delivering something greater than just like the word or the phrase or static content in a 2D experience, that justifies like your seat at the table, your influence. And I find that like we focus a lot kind of on the language expertise, and because it ends up being like our core deliverable. And a lot of us are stretched very thin, and so we end up like, you sort of have a way of like leaning towards that more and more to like deliver the thing that you need to deliver, that you feel like you own, and less time maybe than it feels like you probably could be on strategic frameworks, things of that nature, to sort of prove what you can do as much deeper than just writing content, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I think you've articulated a lot of problems really well. I think the recent layoffs, and when I say recent, I mean in the past sort of 3 years or so, have really put this into perspective for a lot of people, because we saw so many people get laid off. And I think I have no data to back this up, but my suspicion is that design, more so than perhaps other areas, was hit pretty hard. I know, obviously know there are a lot of developers and product managers and marketing people and so on who were let go as well. And that really raised a lot of questions for people. Like, if content design is so important, why are we being let go? Right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
why are they letting us go if we're this critical discipline? And I don't want to go so far as to say that, well, we haven't done enough to prove the value of the work, because I don't think that's true. And I also don't think it's up to individuals to sort of collectively and consistently like explain, why should you keep me in a role? Like, if the company's hiring you, they've clearly demonstrated a need for you. But that having been said, I resonate with your point about sometimes coming off as the language police. And for a long time, software existed without dedicated writers who were writing things. And yes, maybe a lot of the time things weren't great, but the product got built and the product
Yeah.
was successful, right? And so I think inherently there is going to have to be some evangelizing for content design as a discipline, more so than other disciplines. And I think if we don't get comfortable with that, it can be very easy to get resentful about the situation. And I know I've
Yeah.
seen that firsthand. I've experienced it. I'm sure you have as well.
It can get very tiring to feel like you are constantly justifying your existence or your role or your value. And so I'm very sensitive to that. I just like, I feel pretty strongly that, to focus on that and really let it seep in more and more. Um, like the only thing that can do is like make it worse for you,
Yeah.
right? Um, and that's why I find it really interesting and exciting, and at times like even frustrating, but at least like full of possibility, to see some like technological shifts or new opportunities open up that like are new and interesting and exciting and confusing, and thus like could really benefit from the skills of content design to like welcome them people into those experiences for the first time. I think generative AI obviously is like one of those. Everybody's talking about it. That's been big the last couple of years. That's the work that I do at Meta now, but that's not the only thing, right? Like there's um, a lot happening in terms of we don't call it this anymore seemingly, but like the metaverse. There are like immersive 3D virtual worlds and like augmented worlds on top of our own worlds that are being designed for. There are you know uh, like these new forms of interactive media that are somewhere between like a passive viewing experience on Netflix and like an active game, on your Nintendo Switch. And so like there's all these new formats and new fields and new like possibilities opening up. It's like I'd rather spend my time trying to get into those like early spaces because it feels a lot squishier and like a good case for content design to come in and like exert some influence and bring in a little bit of order to chaos, which I feel we're very good at, in a way that can be really good for users and also for like companies and XFN that are trying to make sense of what is exciting, but also like sort of totally out there, blue sky, ambiguous.
Yeah. I want to get a little bit concrete in ways this can sort of come out and actively work against us as content designers, because I've seen it firsthand where you have someone go into a content design role and they are starting to deal with people who are like, why are you here? What's going on? And in order to express their expertise and maybe uh, try to have some control over their area, they start implementing rules. And those rules will be like, everything has to go through content design, or, it has to be this way, or it has to be this way. Now, obviously, there's some truth to a lot of, the rules that are being made. Like, you know, having things be consistent is obviously like just a good UX best practice. But in the way that they start to go about things, not just through operations, but also like in their interpersonal communication, they can come across as very like, I own this area. This is mine, as you just put it before, like the language police, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it can be very standoffish. Now, even as I'm saying this, I'm aware that like there are a whole bunch of stereotypes and built-in assumptions about who should or shouldn't act that way, right? I know you and I are two guys talking. Like this
Yeah.
field is majority women, right? So
Yeah.
like if you and I act in a certain way of like we own this area, that is going to come across as, to a lot of people, as assertive. For if you're a woman doing that, it may come across as like, oh, she's just being bossy or whatever. So obviously there's like heaps of different dynamics. But that being said, like I agree with you that, if we put up too many walls around the area, it just makes things worse. And I
Mm-hmm.
worry that's what's happening.
I worry about that too. And I think it's also very right that you called out like a gendered aspect to this. It will come off differently if you or I make these statements than it will for a woman. And to your point, that's like predominantly what content design is. So that experience is going to be a lot different than ours. Yeah. And I guess like one point on the language police part as well, I think there's like a real, it's not like I'm observing that people go out there and like wear a hat that says language police,
Hmm.
nor is that phrase ever really like thrown out there. I think it just, it can be something that uh, it's sort of a vibe almost, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it's not necessarily our place to make others feel lesser or bad or wrong for their word choices or their preferences or even their feedback, just because they're not a content designer. And so like, I think a really easy, like subtle shift in that is just being, which is also like a trademark of like a good collaborator, is just being very open to feedback and actively seeking it out and just bringing people along in your process. Um, in terms of like the word choices that you make, the frameworks that you build, um, and resisting the urge to say, like, I own this, or really chafe against anybody's perceived attempt to like land grab that from you. Um, you know, for content design, like our closest partnerships can be product design, and ideally are like that's a really really valuable partnership. I've worked with great PDs who have made my work uh, not only like look better literally, but also just fundamentally better because of how talented they are as designers. And like though they like it's a very very healthy give and take. Of like their feedback on my content, and like sometimes they're good content designers too, so if they like ask for my feedback on what should be written in a given interface and I see things that like really already make sense, like I'm not going to change that or find a synonym for it or a different way to say it just because like I should own that, right?
Mm.
I think
Yeah.
it's finding ways to like work symbiotically with your partners, and have them understand like your thought process no matter what, and just like be a good partner above all, versus again like giving off the aura that you have to run away into a corner and own anything that has to do with language, and you'll come back to your partner or your team members when it's ready, if that makes sense.
So part of the issue here is that content design itself, as I mentioned before, is not a core principle of a tech stack, for instance. So, you need code, obviously, to run the thing. You need a database, you need a server, you need deployment, you need some sort of user interface.
Mm.
And I think for a lot of people, text is, or good text, or what we might call engaging text, is decoration.
Yep.
And I think I don't want to agree with that, but I also think that there's a part of that content designers need to acknowledge. Like the product could succeed without you here is
Mm-hmm.
probably true. And there's a little bit of humility to sort of accept when going about that. And that can seem a little bit scary to say because it's almost like you're denying the credibility of the role. But
Mm.
in many ways, I think it's necessary to do the type of work that we're talking about, to be able to, to walk into a room and acknowledge that, your job, everything could happen without you there, depending on the product. But you are still there for a reason. I don't know. I
Mm-hmm.
just think there needs to be a little bit more balance there.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I think humility is definitely a big part of the game. I wonder. Um, there's a part of this, like for me personally, that and I wonder if you feel this way too. Having a journalism background, um, and really like holding on to like writing and editing as your core skills in your career. And so jumping from that to like content design at Meta, formerly content strategy, I was kind of like, this is great. uh, I like it pays much better than that did. It feels way more stable. Debatable whether that's still true now, but at the time, it was really like a big difference for me. And I was just, candidly, like kind of glad to be there. I'm like, I'm going to learn a lot. I feel like I have a stable job. Um, I'll meet some cool people. I'll build up some great skills. I'm going to see what I can do here as it relates to like um, building my like UX sense, my product thinking, maybe some design chops here and there. Like it just felt like there was a lot of possibility. And so I try to carry that like humility, even as I push towards like year 8, end of year 8, like, and so you're sort of right also that I guess as if you think of a product team, content design is often, maybe not totally inconsequential. Like we have built up the practice, and we should be thankful to like the leaders of the discipline for getting to this point for sure. So there's definitely been some justification, especially at like some of these larger, more established content design teams, of which Meta is one. That's a big deal. But like where it goes next, like how do we grow, especially as there's a lot of change in the industry? Like that's a question I've been asking a lot. And I don't think it's spending a lot of time like worrying
Yeah.
about, this perception that we're like less valuable, we're seen as less valuable, maybe we're compensated less than some of our UX peers, certainly like the product and engineering peers. That is all true. I'm a human being who would probably appreciate like making more money and feeling validation for the work that I do. Sure. But, in terms of like, you said something really interesting about like the, the point, like not being super important. This could happen without us. An interesting conversation would be like, is it possible to move ourselves, if not totally make ourselves like irreplaceable, then to like move the conversation that way,
Hmm.
so that we're seen as more critical? And like, what are the ways that we could do that? Especially as you see a lot of these new possibilities come online, AI, AR and VR, interactive storytelling, so on and so forth. Like, how can we wedge our way into those spaces with like a little bit more gusto and strength than we could have 10, 15 more years ago, so that we can actually be seen as and literally be more critical than we were? Like, for example, like in the AI space, like you see, and I know you've had conversations about this with a lot of folks too, model design, content engineering, prompt engineering, whatever you want to call it, that sort of emerged as like a possibility for content designers too. One thought would be like, is there such a thing as like a full stack content professional?
Hmm. Yeah.
So somebody who can really like uh, roll on the UX layer, like as we know a good content designer does now, but can also pair that with like a deep understanding of what's going on several layers below, and it can even be a connection point to bubble those things up into the UI in clear ways. Like just trying to think of ways to make ourselves more critical, I guess, to where
Hmm.
product is going. Do you know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. Yeah. And I think the idea of like a full stack content designer is an attractive one. And I think there's also the idea of what reality is versus perception as well.
Hmm.
Because, obviously, if I thought content design wasn't critical, I wouldn't be doing the job I am now. I do think it is critical, but it's about getting people to recognize that. And also, I think that's why I put so much emphasis a lot of the time on ROI and metrics and measurement. And I know this is a controversial point because for a lot of things, testing is difficult and not even necessary a lot of the time. But I do think that there is something to be said for the fact that the more that you can tie what you're doing to actual results, then the easier a time you're going to have it.
Yeah.
And I've seen firsthand what can happen when you don't spend that time doing that work. Your team gets let go.
Hmm.
And, is that unfair? Yes. Like, should that be happening? No. But the unfortunate reality is that, for content designers, you work within an organizational framework that prioritizes usually money. And for some organizations, that may not be the case.
Hmm.
But and it's hard too because you a lot of the time you're like, well, I know that what I do has impact. How do I tell the story to go from here to here to here to here? And a lot of the time, what I found is that when I was starting to do this earlier in my career, I would go like, okay, well, I need to prove that this what I'm doing has impact here. So what's the data I need in order to get that? Okay, well, I would need this particular metric. Oh, the software doesn't have that capability built in. Now I need to go and try and figure, you know what I mean? So you come up against, these roadblocks, I guess appropriately, and it becomes difficult. But that to me is where I think a lot of content designers would be better off spending their time and less time about. I shouldn't get annoyed at this, but like whenever I see style guide debates, I'm just like, I don't care. Like I don't care.
Yeah.
Just pick something and go with it. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Yes, is sentence case probably better than title case? Yeah, sure. But like I don't ultimately care really about
Yeah.
what gets picked or what doesn't.
Yeah. It's not that interesting to have an opinion on the Oxford comma anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I don't mean to sound like bitter. It's just, I'm with you. I think that that's true. And so like, where should that energy go?
That's the question. Where should
Yeah,
where should we be putting it? Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And to your point, I think like, the data driven stuff is important. You want to be able to demonstrate the value of what you actually do with like clear impact to the business. Um, every other function has to do that too. I think at times the UX functions kind of get like off a little scot free because we're seen as creatives more, and maybe certain like performance systems value that a little less than somebody like a data scientist or an engineer. At the same time, speaking of like influence and trying to make yourself irreplaceable, I just think it goes a long way when you are able to like batch your arguments, your solutions, using the same tools as these other like really established functions do, whether that's like you're talking about trade-offs with like a nice stoplight chart, you have actual like uh, data to back up like a given argument or a framework, or even like a style guide that you're suggesting. Like it's a style guide not based on like AP, it's based on like here's what works with people that use our products. Um, and even like a knack for visual storytelling, like that goes a long way. If you're able to like show something beautiful in a deck, in a prototype, in just static mocks, like if you're just able to add some flair to the thing that like you're trying to articulate, I don't know, like that feels right to me as like places to try to put that energy. Even though things like voice and tone frameworks, style guides, so on and so forth, like have been our bread and butter for a long time, and like it's hard. Uh, you want to clutch onto those things because they feel like this is the unique value that we bring. Unfortunately, I don't think people put as much value on those things as we do as content designers. So like that's something that we have to recognize and figure out like, well, what are the things that people would value that we only, it's still true that only we could uniquely provide.
Yeah. I think there's a I think adaptability is a virtue, and being able to, as you've said sort of throughout this chat, being able to identify where are the new opportunities, the new frontiers. 30 years ago, 35 years ago, however many years ago, it was like information architecture. And then it became more about, like the mobile interface and so on. Where are we going next? What value can we provide? And to me, it's just so much of the conversation right now is about going back to basics in terms of like structured data, because
Mm.
so many, I mean, I'm sure as you know, so many companies like AI this and AI that, and meanwhile the and many people have pointed this out before, like the basics of their information and their data is sort of, it's just laying there like begging for attention.
Yeah, absolutely.
So to me, that's like where content designers can have significant value, is reminding companies like, hey, you want to use AI, then you need to get your house in order in terms of this other stuff first. I think that's a good example of like engaging with that conversation rather than sort of running away from it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I sort of, um, I don't know. I think like as a content design community, like it would just be great for us to like have these conversations more with each other, right?
Hmm.
I, there's there can be a lot of like hand wringing over certain things, like common, like we wouldn't be having this conversation if like some part of what I wrote didn't resonate with you. And I didn't write it to like blast CD. I actually probably wouldn't have written it if I didn't think that there were actually some interesting solutions like at hand. And
Mm.
so maybe we can see it as like a call to have those conversations, right? Because I similarly don't think that I would be in this field if I truly felt like it was a dead end. It's just a matter of like, we've come this far, like, how do we go farther?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Did you get any pushback from people for it? Any comments?
No, honestly.
That's good.
Yeah, I would welcome that, though, honestly, if that's the case, and maybe we'll see from like a continued conversation about it. But yeah, I would also like thank you for. I mean, I'm glad it caught your eye because you're promoting it brought a lot of like great people into my orbit, and I had some really interesting conversations
Awesome.
just about it. It seemed to be stimulating for folks, which shows me that like this, of course, is not a unique point of view. Like people are thinking about this or stressing about it or wondering about it. So like, let's just have the convo out in the open.
Yeah. Awesome. Cool. Well, this has been a fantastic chat. I think we've given people, some really good next steps and some things for them to do, and hopefully, if something for people to think about. Where can people find you online and connect with you?
Yeah. So we've been referencing this piece that I wrote. I did that on my Substack. It's called Footbridge, footbridge.substack.com. And elsewhere, I'm V as in Victor and then Beigelman, my last name, V as in boy, Eigelman, Instagram, the platform formerly known as Twitter, even though truthfully, like I really just lurk on
Yep.
most platforms these days. I don't post a lot. Substack, I'm actually quite active.
Okay.
And that
Great.
seems to be growing a lot. So I think, if you want to have a conversation, let's bring it there.
Awesome. Victor, this has been great. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Patrick. I appreciate you having me on.
All right, that was my interview with Victor. Thanks for tuning in today. Just remember, 25% off at UX Content Collective this week through April 6th. And I hope you join me for the next interview in a couple of weeks. See you then.